The crew that went down in the winter of 1912 was not looking for anything. That is the first thing to understand. They were maintenance workers, boilermen, employed by the Vanderbilt household staff to inspect the heating infrastructure beneath the breakers before the season turned. The estate was closed. The family was elsewhere. The tunnels beneath the mansion were cold and dark and entirely unremarkable, as far as any of them expected. They found the lower passage about 40 feet in. The official service tunnel was there exactly as the plans described. A brick-lined corridor running north beneath the mansion, wide enough for a coal cart, mapped in the original 1893 construction documents filed with Newport's building authority. Then one of the workers noticed that the floor, near a section of damaged brick, was not solid. Beneath the broken surface was stone, not poured concrete, not the cast iron and brick of a Vanderbilt-era utility corridor. Fitted granite blocks, dry-laid and precisely cut, in a technique that any working mason in 1912 would have recognized immediately as old. Older than the breakers, older than the earlier estate that had burned on this same plot in 1892, older, by the look of it, than anything that should reasonably have been under that ground. They went further. Where the granite continued, the floor dropped into a narrower lower passage, running in approximately the same direction but cut directly into the bedrock of the Ochre Point promontory. The walls were fitted stone, the ceiling was low, and running along the eastern wall, cut into the floor at a shallow angle, was a channel, not drainage, not a utility groove, a seawater channel, still wet, still moving with a rhythm that corresponded to nothing mechanical, only to tide. That detail deserves a moment. A seawater channel below a Gilded Age boiler tunnel, beneath a mansion completed in 1895, still carrying ocean water in the winter of 1912, not a pipe remnant, not surface runoff, a cut stone channel that moved with the Atlantic. Infrastructure like that does not happen by accident. It does not appear as a side effect of some other construction. Someone needed tidal water inside a buried coastal passage, and they built the means to get it precisely enough that it still functioned nearly a century later. There was more. The walls carried survey marks, chiselled into the granite at regular intervals, deliberate and spaced. Not the scratched measurements of Vanderbilt construction crews checking tolerances, not American industrial notation from the 1890s. A different marking system entirely, one the workers could not identify, and one that no official record has ever attempted to explain. And at the northern end of the passage, approximately 60 feet in from where the workers first entered, there was a chamber. Not a collapsed section, not a natural void in the rock. A rectangular room, fitted with the same granite, its entrance sealed with mortar visibly different in composition from the surrounding walls. Newer mortar applied over older masonry. Someone had sealed that room at some point after the original passage was built. The workers reported what they found. They filed something with Newport's building authority, or they tried to. That report no longer exists in the public record. The file for the 1912 inspection shows a gap that building staff in later decades could not account for. What survives, if the family account is accurate, is a reference to a payroll record listing the crew, and a private letter written decades later by a grandson of one of those workers, passed to a local historical archive without expectation of response. The letter is brief. It describes what his grandfather told the family. A stone passage, salt water still moving through it, marks on the walls that didn't belong to any system the old man recognized, and a sealed door at the end that nobody opened. The archive logged the letter and filed it. Nothing more came of it. This is not a ghost story. It is a construction anomaly described in first-hand family testimony, and notable primarily because the official record of its discovery vanished at exactly the moment when its existence would have been most inconvenient. Here is what the official history says. The breakers was completed in 1895 by architect Richard Morris Hunt for Cornelius Vanderbilt II, replacing an earlier summer house on the same Ochre Point plot that had been destroyed by fire 3 years before. The land was cleared, old foundations removed, and new construction began. The service tunnel documented in Hunt's plans was standard for the era, a coal delivery and boiler access corridor, designed to keep the industrial necessities of heating and maintenance invisible to family and guests above. In the accepted version, The Breakers is a story that begins with the Vanderbilt Commission and ends with a monument to American ambition. The land beneath it is simply land. The infrastructure beneath it is simply infrastructure. Nothing below. The breakers predates the Vanderbilts, because the Vanderbilts remade that ground in their image. That version has a problem. The masonry technique described in the account, fitted granite, dry laid, was consistent with pre-industrial coastal construction in the region, predating the Vanderbilt era by at least a generation. The specific method of cutting and fitting granite blocks for subterranean coastal passages was a labour-intensive and precise practice, used in Newport for harbour infrastructure, fortification work and maritime storage. The kind of construction a working Atlantic port city built when it needed to move water, hold cargo near the tide line, or channel seawater for specific use. By the time Cornelius Vanderbilt II commissioned Hunt to design the breakers, that technique had been obsolete for decades. No construction crew in 1893 was dry-laying granite blocks in subterranean passages beneath a coal tunnel, which means the lower passage was not Vanderbilt-era construction. It was already there when excavation crews broke ground in 1893. It was already there beneath the earlier estate. It was there before any recorded building on that specific parcel of Ochre Point land. Someone built it. Someone used it. And when the wealthiest family in America decided to place a 70-room palazzo on that ground, whatever was already buried there was enclosed beneath the new construction and removed from the architectural record. This is where the story stops being about a Gilded Age mansion and starts being about what had to be buried for the mansion to mean what it was supposed to mean. Newport in the 18th and early 19th centuries was not the place it became. Before the summer colony, before the marble and the carriages and the orchestrated leisure, Newport was among the 5 largest cities in colonial America, a working Atlantic port with one of the most active harbour systems on the eastern seaboard. It was built on maritime trade, on fishing, on provisioning, and on commerce that frequently preferred not to be fully documented. The Ochre Point promontory sits above 2 tidal channels with direct Atlantic access. In the era before the Gilded Age reshaped its meaning, that positioning was not scenic. It was strategic. High ground above tidal water, set back from the main harbour, with clear sightlines to offshore approach, exactly where pre-industrial coastal infrastructure was placed. Seawater channels for fish holding, tide-fed storage for perishable cargo held before sail. In documented cases along the New England coast, concealed passages connected to the shoreline were used when certain trade preferred not to pass through the harbour master's records. The British occupied Newport from 1776 to 1779. During those 3 years, harbour infrastructure was used extensively, modified, and, according to post-war documents, in some cases deliberately removed from public record after the occupation ended. Newport's merchant class emerged from the Revolution in a difficult position. Some had traded under the occupation. Some had moved cargo through channels that, once the war was over, they preferred not to have on any official chart. The incentive to quietly retire certain pieces of coastal infrastructure from the record was not abstract. It was reputational, financial, and in some cases legal. A seawater channel beneath Ochre Point, built in the pre-industrial period, sealed at some later date, still carrying tidal water in 1912, that did not survive because it was maintained. It survived because it was buried. Buried first under decades of disuse, then under estate foundations, then under the construction mythology of the Gilded Age itself. What makes the 1912 account significant is not the passage. That passage almost certainly had a rational origin, even if an obscured one. What makes it significant is what happened to the record of finding it. The Ochre Point land that became the estate district was not purchased in one transaction. Through the 1880s and into the early 1890s, properties along the coastal ridge changed hands steadily. Old Newport families sold. Generational maritime estates, properties held since the colonial and early federal period, carrying all the layered history that implied, were transferred to new buyers. The buyers were not random. They were a concentrated group, industrialists and their proxies, operating through a small number of Newport real estate agents and a smaller number of title attorneys, all embedded in the same social network that would manage the legal and administrative machinery of the cottage colony. The land acquisition pattern followed the coastline. It prioritized promontory sites with water access and tidal exposure. It moved with consistency. That pattern does not prove intent, but the attorneys who handled those transfers were the same attorneys who filed the construction permits for the estates that followed, and the building authority staff who would later receive, and lose, the 1912 inspection report worked within a city government that had reorganised significantly in the decade before the cottage boom, with key positions going to men connected to the same network of lawyers and agents who had managed the coastal land sales. Consider what the presence of the lower passage actually required. If the excavation crews in 1893 found it, someone made a decision. Not a panicked one. Construction foremen encounter unexpected subsurface conditions regularly. A deliberate decision. The passage was not documented. The architectural drawings filed with the city show only the planned service tunnel. The lower level does not appear. The seawater channel does not appear. The sealed chamber does not appear. Something below the breakers was observed, assessed, and removed from the record before the permit was finalised. Someone did that. That is not an absence. That is an act. The sealed chamber had been closed with mortar visibly different from the surrounding stone. Newer material applied over older blockwork. Someone sealed that chamber before Vanderbilt construction ever began, and in 1912, when boilermen found both the chamber and the passage that led to it, the report of that discovery was entered into a file that no longer exists. The workers described a smell near the chamber door. Salt, timber rot, something they couldn't name. Nobody opened it. The record was removed. The passage was sealed above and below. For decades, the only account of what those workers found lived in the private memory of one family, passed down until a grandson finally wrote it in a letter and sent it to a historical archive that filed it and went quiet. The question is not only what is behind that sealed door. The question is who decided in 1912 that answering it was more dangerous than leaving it shut, and whether that decision was the first time the question had been asked, or simply the most recent time it had been answered the same way. The survey marks are where the second layer begins, not as decoration, not as a curiosity set aside in the shock of finding the passage itself. They are, read correctly, the detail that changes the entire scale of what those workers encountered. Survey marks chiselled into pre-industrial granite were not incidental. They were reference points, notation in an organised system of measurement, orientation, or record-keeping. Harbour charts used them. Military surveyors used them. Colonial-era drainage and tidal management projects used them. A sequence of marks cut into the wall of a subterranean coastal passage at regular intervals was not graffiti left by a labourer. It was evidence that the passage belonged to something larger, a mapped system with a purpose, and presumably a corresponding document somewhere above ground. The Newport Historical Society holds harbour charts from the 1780s through the early 1800s. Some were produced by American surveyors. Some were produced under British authority during the occupation. What they show along the Ochre Point coastline is a pattern of survey notation that does not correspond to any publicly filed land survey of that period. The notation clusters are there, documented and catalogued. What they reference is not. The corresponding records do not appear at Newport, at the Rhode Island State Archives, or among the relevant holdings at the National Archives. The marks on the charts point to a system. The system has no public file. This does not require a theory. It requires only the recognition that the survey marks found in the lower passage beneath the breakers were part of a structure whose paper record, if it ever existed in a public archive, is now gone. The marks were placed. The system was real. Whoever built that passage was working within an organised framework that someone, at some later point, allowed to become undocumented. That is the detail that changes the scale. Newport before the summer colony was a city of a specific kind. By the mid-18th century, it was among the busiest Atlantic ports in the colonies, connected to the Caribbean, to Britain, to the West African trade routes that sustained the most profitable and the most morally catastrophic commerce of the era. Newport merchants were deeply invested in the transatlantic slave trade. That fact belongs in this account not as a moral digression, but as infrastructure context, because the coastal construction those merchants built was not built for leisure. It was built for movement, for holding, for concealment when necessary. Seawater channels preserved perishable cargo between landing and sail. Tidal passages moved goods outside the harbour master's inspection corridor. The Ochre Point promontory, elevated above 2 tidal channels, set apart from the main harbour inspection machinery, with direct Atlantic sight lines. That was exactly the kind of location serious maritime commerce valued for reasons that did not always appear in the harbour master's logbook. When the British occupied Newport from 1776 to 1779, they inherited a port whose infrastructure reflected those priorities. They used it. They modified it. When they withdrew, they left behind a city whose relationship to its own coastal record had become complicated. Newport's merchant class emerged from the Revolution in a difficult position. Some had traded under the occupation. Some had moved cargo through channels they preferred not to have on any post-war chart. The incentive to retire certain pieces of coastal infrastructure from the official record was real, reputational, financial, and in some cases, legal. A passage sealed after its period of active use, its survey notation matching no public document, its tidal channel still functional but disconnected from any recorded maintenance. That is entirely consistent with infrastructure that someone in the post-occupation years preferred not to document. Not hidden because it was criminal, hidden because its existence mapped loyalties and movements that were inconvenient once the war was over. The passage may have been sealed not to conceal what it was, but to retire what it implied about who had used it. The sealing was not about hiding a crime, it was about managing a history, ensuring that when someone eventually built on that land, or sold it, or filed a deed, the story that accompanied the transaction would be clean. By the early 19th century, Newport's maritime economy was fading. The old merchant families held their coastal properties, but no longer needed the working infrastructure those properties had once concealed. The promontory sat quiet, its passages sealed or simply abandoned, its survey marks weathering slowly into the granite without any file to update. The city remade itself, the working port receded, and the land along Ochre Point waited. And then, in the 1880s, someone started buying the land above it, steadily, systematically, one property at a time, moving along the ridge. The acquisition pattern along the Ochre Point coastal ridge is documented in Newport land records, and it does not look random. The properties changed hands through the 1880s and into the early 1890s, in a sequence that appeared to follow the natural promontory systematically. The sellers were old Newport families, names that appear in colonial-era merchant records and post-revolution civic rosters in the genealogical history of a city that had once been wealthy, contracted, and was now being purchased. The buyers were a concentrated group, industrialists and their proxies, working through a small number of Newport real estate agents and a smaller number of title attorneys embedded in the same social network that would manage the administrative machinery of the cottage colony. The land acquisition followed the coastline. It prioritized sites with tidal access. It moved with consistency. The attorneys facilitating those transfers appear in the permit records for the estates that followed. The same names, the same firms. In at least 2 cases, the same individual who handled the land purchase also filed the construction permit for the mansion built on that land. This meant that a single professional, over the course of normal work, had full access to both the prior history of the property and the construction records created on it. Any subsurface discovery during excavation would have passed through a network already oriented toward managing the gap between what the land had been and what it was now supposed to become. The Newport Building Authority file gap for the 1912 incident is not the only one. Permit records from the Ochre Point construction period show at least 2 similar anomalies. A contractor's field log from one property references a subsurface discovery at a depth consistent with pre-industrial stonework. That notation does not appear in the filed permit. The permit moves from foundation preparation to framing with nothing between. In at least one other case, a contractor referenced in connection with an anomalous notation is difficult to trace in any subsequent Newport construction record. Not transferred, not retired, the trail simply stopping after a single document that acknowledged something unexpected in the ground. A pattern, if the archive gaps are read together. The same coastal ridge, the same professional network, the same gap between what was found and what was filed. The suppression of the 1912 report was not a household staff's panicked reaction. It was the continuation of a mechanism operating quietly for at least 2 decades before those workers went down into that tunnel. The protocol was already in place. The mechanism existed because the stakes were specific. The Gilded Age cottage economy of Newport required a particular mythology, that the estates were acts of pure creation. Raw coastline made meaningful by capital and taste. The Vanderbilts had not bought a site with a history. They had created a monument. The land before the mansion was in this telling nothing. Cleared ground, blank coast, a promontory waiting for purpose. Any evidence contradicting this was not merely aesthetically inconvenient. if the land had documented prior function, if its title chain ran back through transactions to colonial maritime infrastructure connected to occupation-era trade, to the commercial networks of old Newport families, then what had been purchased was not blank space. It was a specific history, one that certain people had spent considerable effort making invisible, and that had been transferred along with the acreage and the ocean view. The erasure of the lower passage protected the Vanderbilt estate's claim to origin. It also protected something larger, the entire framework by which Ochre Point had been assembled, priced and converted from old Newport maritime property into the most celebrated resort real estate in Gilded Age America. The architects, the title companies, the building authority, the city officials, none were independent of the families whose interests they served. The silence was not conspiracy in the sense of a meeting held and a plan made. It was the natural behaviour of interlocking institutions that shared a stake in one version of what Newport's land was and had always been. Silence, in that context, was not a choice. It was a structural condition. Put the case plainly. Pre-Gilded Age, Newport had a dense working coastal infrastructure with ties to colonial trade, occupation-era activity, and old maritime family networks whose descendants were among the city's most respected citizens by 1895. The land acquisition along Ochre Point moved through a concentrated professional network and targeted promontory sites with tidal access. Subsurface discoveries during construction were removed from public record across multiple documented properties. The institutions responsible for that record were not independent of the commissioning families. The mythology of the estates as pure creation required that prior infrastructure remain buried, literally and administratively, for the official story to hold. That is what the official story was built to do. The Gilded Age did not build over empty land. It built over a managed silence, and that silence was as much a construction as anything above ground. The Gilded Age did not merely celebrate what was built, it laundered the land beneath it. The workers who went down in the winter of 1912 were not looking for any of this. They found stone where there should have been earth, water where there should have been nothing, marks on a wall that belonged to a system nobody living could name. They wrote a report. The report disappeared. The passage was sealed. The chamber at the north end stayed shut. Its contents left in the condition they had been in since someone sealed that door in the late 18th or early 19th century for reasons clear enough at the time to justify the work. The Breakers still stands on Ochre Point. It is among the most visited historic houses in the United States. Every year, people walk its marble floors and stand on its ocean terrace and look at the Atlantic that Richard Morris Hunt framed with such precision. The interpretive materials call it a monument to American ambition. They do not mention the building authority file that no longer exists. That description is not wrong. It is incomplete in a way that is by now very old. Below the north end of the service tunnel, behind a sealed door whose mortar is newer than the stone around it, the question that those workers left unanswered remains unanswered. Not because nobody knows it is there, because at every moment when someone might have opened it, the same calculation made in 1893 and again in 1912 appears to have been made again. The question is too old to matter officially. The answer is too inconvenient to be worth pursuing through the formal channels that managed it away in the first place. The visible story is a monument. What the monument stands over is something else. And the distance between those two things, between what the building was built to mean and what the ground beneath it actually holds, is not a mystery that was lost. It is a gap that was maintained by people who understood exactly what they were protecting and why the protection had to hold.